Too close.
No.
You're fine.
No. It's all right. Unless your eyes are going to get tired.
Well, I was thinking maybe I would be in the video. I don't know.
All right, well, welcome
Back-
everybody. I imagine you all know who I am. I'm Morak. I'm the director of the local government program. I'd like to welcome you, both those of you who are in person and those who are watching online, to our second local governance seminar of this year. As you know, we run these at least a couple of times a semester, and today I'm really pleased to have with us, and I'm very interested to hear what he has to say, Professor Zack Taylor. Quite a few of you probably know Zack because I think he's been teaching a number of the people in the room in the Research Methods course this term. Zack joined us about 1.5 years ago at Western as assistant professor of political science. Before that, he spent 3 years as assistant professor at the University of Toronto. Zack has not only a PhD in urban politics and in political science, excuse me, but he's also a registered urban planner. He had a practice as an urban planner before he became an academic. And I think that feeds into Zack's research interests. Zack's research interests are in regional governance, city regional governance, planning and development at the city regional level, both in Canada and comparatively. He's published a number of articles on that subject, also has done work on electoral dynamics in the city of Toronto, has published work on the state of the urban politics discipline in Canada, and has done some real groundbreaking comparative work on the comparative historical development of urban governance and planning and development in Canadian and American cities. But today he's going to be talking to us about something a little different than that. He's been doing some work on understanding, conceptualizing, and measuring governance quality at the local level, and that's what we're going to hear about today. So please welcome Zack Taylor.
Thank you, Martin. This is such a large crowd. I'm very pleased. I believe, I had an email from Shireen at the Ministry of Municipal Affairs that they've actually set up a conference room, a boardroom at 777 Bay. So there may be some people watching there. So welcome as well. This project is one that kind of landed in my lap. Enid Slack at the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the University of Toronto. Are we having feedback or something?
No.
Okay, all right. Enid Slack at the IMFG, the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the University of Toronto, approached me and asked me if I would be interested in writing something about good government. Good government. What do we mean by good government? And that started me down a road that culminated in the production of a paper published by IMFG, which goes into much more detail than what I'm able to talk about today. So I encourage you to look into that if you find any of this interesting or provocative. I'm just going to take this at a pretty high level today. I should acknowledge the insightful comments and people who read various drafts of this. Martin Horak, of course, also Gabriel Edelman and Philip Abrams, formerly of the University of the City of Toronto, and Richard Bird also read it, and Dr. Alison Schott, graduate of Western's program, also did some research assistance and helped think about this at the earliest stage. So I do encourage you to take a look at the report. We'll be sure to post these slides so that you can follow that up later. So when I started this project, I thought, okay, good governance, good government. This will be relatively easy to think about. There must be generally understood. There must be a generally understood way of thinking about this that can be applied to local government, that we can take off the shelf to think about this sort of thing. But the more I got into it, the more I realized that there's really quite different understandings, different schools of thought about how we should think about good governance, or just to make a bit of a shift in the terminology, the quality of governance. So, there are fundamental questions in play here. What is government for? What should it be for? Are local governments different from national governments? So should our understanding of governance quality be different when we're talking about municipalities or even school boards or other local bodies? Or can we use these same concepts at all levels? How should we think about and evaluate the informal or soft aspects of governance that lie beyond formal institutions and processes of local government, right? We have all kinds of relationships, private delivery of public services. We have voluntary sector agents that deliver public services. How should we think of all that in the context of governance quality? How should we think of the complex tangles of intergovernmental relations that connect the national, provincial, and local governments when we think about this? Is good governance context dependent, or is it relative? Is it something that we can think about globally, or is it something where the definition changes depending on the time and the place, right? So can we compare across jurisdictions, or do we really need to stay within a case to understand or evaluate good governance? And back to the terminological distinction at the top here, should governance quality be thought of as a sliding scale from worse to better, right? Or can we arrive at a singular definition of what good means that we can think of as a threshold? So we often see these terms, good governance, good government, but what is good? What is it something where you know it when you see it? Is it something you have or don't have, or is it something that's relative? So before we can discuss how to assess or measure good governance and apply these ideas at the local level, I think we need to investigate its potential meanings. Only when we understand the meanings can we get to the task of thinking about evaluation or measurement. And certainly when I was approached to undertake this project, I think the goal that IMFG had in mind was that somehow we could quantify good governance, that we could assign a number to it and say, well, if you have more than a 7, you have good governance. If you don't, then you don't. So how do we think about measurement in this context? Since we have a bit of a healthy audience today, I thought I'd throw out a question, a show of hands. So who would agree with the statement that good governance or quality of governance is fundamentally about process, about the degree to which people are included in process, the degree to which the preferences of populations are translated into different ideas? Okay, so we have Martin's putting his hand up. So, okay, Josh, you have to believe in that because you're the city councilor. So,
what's the alternative? Are there other choices?
Okay, so the alternative is, should we assess good governance solely on the basis of results, of what comes out the other end? Right, so who thinks that the only thing that really matters is what actually happens, what comes out the other end? Okay, Bob, Andy, maybe? Okay.
Depends on who judges what happens.
Well, this is it, Andy, right? Is that these require a different, you have to wear a different set of glasses or wear a different hat in order to sort of think about these two different ways of thinking about things. And I think when you as I'm going to talk about shortly, when you look at the literature on these things, there's quite a strong division between people who focus on process as the defining characteristic of good governance, and the people who focus on outputs or outcomes as the definition of good governance. So I want to kind of pick that apart a little bit and make an argument that when you scan the literature on this broadly, you tend to find 3 different perspectives on it that don't really talk to each other very much. So a substantial portion of the paper is kind of a review of these these three perspectives, kind of an overview and synthesis of these perspectives drawn from a wide and eclectic range of sources. Each of these has its home domain and scale of analysis. I'll talk about that shortly. So the first approach I want to talk about is the notion of the quality of decision-making processes and the quality of implementation processes. So what we're talking about here are the processes through which things happen. So when you scan the literature on this, you see that there are a number of ways of thinking about this, or ways into this, appear over and over and over again. So certainly in the literature on urban planning, you find a lot of discussion about inclusivity or participation, right? That the measure of good governance, or good governance, is a function of the ability of processes to genuinely integrate people's preferences and interests. You also see a lot of attention given to accountability. So the ability of institutions, processes that happen with institutions, to be transparent, to provide oversight of what goes on, to provide opportunities for recourse, so that if bad things happen to you as a result of what government does, you have the ability to seek recourse for them. Impartiality is often talked about. So does government, through its actions, treat people equally, impartially? We also see a lot of attention to competence. So there's a huge body of work in public administration on meritocracy in public service, on ensuring that public servants are appropriately trained and able to do the jobs that they've been tasked. There's also attention to learning, the ability of public administration to learn from its mistakes and to mobilize knowledge, both factual and technical evidence, but also tacit or experiential knowledge from the public in a way that is productive. And finally, there's attention to the timeliness of processes. So do they actually solve problems before it's really too late, right? Before the horses have escaped the barn, if you will. So you often see a process focus in the literature on planning, and you find it a lot in the literature on public administration. And the focus here is really on government institutions, on the way that institutions operate, and the way that the people who work within institutions do their jobs. Another perspective, and the boundaries between these are a bit fuzzy, but there is something distinct going on here, is there is an attention to what I'm calling here outputs. So this is the quality of the rules and the regulations and the institutions that are created by decision-making processes. So laws and regulations, bylaws, and so on. And so we see a focus on the productivity of outputs, so the efficiency, the sort of utilitarian cost benefit of the outputs of decision-making processes. We see also attention to what I've called proportionality, by which I mean that the enactment that is made in response to a problem is proportional to that problem. It isn't, hitting a nail with a sledgehammer, nor is it an underpowered solution to the problem. Policy coherence. So is what you're producing something that is internally consistent and is able to achieve its objectives? And also adaptability. So circumstances change. Our policies designed in a way that they can function as context changes. And this has resonance with emerging literatures on institutional and policy resilience and change. And we often see this focus, both in public administration and especially these ideas of proportionality and coherence and adaptability we see in literature and public policy as distinct from administration. And so the focus is really on bureaucratic practices and the way that, that bureaucracies operate. Now, a third approach is about outcomes as distinct from outputs. So what this has to do with is the substantive social, economic, and environmental impacts of what governance does, of policies. So, you know, there's a very well-developed body of literature that you'll find in international development, especially. You know, the World Bank writes about this. It's really focused at the nation-state level, and the focus is on actual material conditions, which are viewed as the outputs of government action. Now, that may be problematic in a bunch of ways, as I'm going to discuss in a minute. But what you find in the World Bank's case is that they regularly publish good governance indicators that put a lot of weight on actual material conditions coming out the other end. So GDP growth, degree of socioeconomic inequality, you know, amounts of pollution, public health outcomes, and so on. So you know, to borrow a phrase from Rothberg, who writes a lot about this in political science, you know, he says, look, irreducibly good governance is performance and results. And that's it. You can do whatever you want, but if it doesn't actually have good performance and results, then it's not good governance. So when we think about these different lenses or perspectives, we need to kind of bring to the surface the different normative commitments that underlie these different perspectives. So, you know, if we look at process first, and I think this is really quite visible in the urban planning literature, there's this often implicit presumption that if you have a really good process, it will necessarily produce good results, right? So there's a lot of emphasis on perfecting process, of trying to make things as inclusive as possible, a lot of focus on fairness, on making sure every voice is heard, figuring out who should be at the table, and so on. The output approach implicitly assumes that good outputs necessarily produce good outcomes. So if you have a really good coherent law that truly addresses the problem, is proportional to the problem, that it will necessarily have the impact that you expect it to have. And implicitly in the outcome-oriented approach, there's an acceptance of the idea that good outcomes are genuinely an indicator of good governance, right? That if you have economic growth, if you have improving public health, if you have low socioeconomic inequality and so on, if you have less corruption, then these things are all evidence of the fact that you have good governance. But that may be an indirect perspective. So I think that these provoke a bunch of questions that we need to think about. In part, we need to, in a process perspective, we need to think about the relationship between institutions and norms, right? You can have the best designed institutions, but if people don't behave the way they're supposed to inside them, then what happens, right? Can good institutions make bad people do good things, right? Or, you know, can people do good things within bad institutions, right? What is the relationship there? Also, is there a trade-off of the degree to which a process is inclusive and has a high degree of accountability within it? Is there a trade-off between inclusivity and accountability and policy innovation and timeliness, right? So there's a critique out there of processes being perhaps overly democratic, right? That there's sort of consulting overload or oversight overload in a way that bogs down processes and undermines timeliness, especially. So if you have too many checks and balance, right? Checks and balances, do you undermine the way what ends up happening? On the output side, is there a trade-off between inclusivity and policy coherence, right? This is often a critique that is explored in the context of congressional government in the United States, right? Where you have legislation produced through bargaining processes that basically trade off benefits. This is often called log rolling, in a way that produces policies that reach a threshold of acceptance and approval, but are ultimately incoherent. They contain elements that work against, that are internally inconsistent and work at cross purposes to each other, perhaps undermining the ability to accomplish anything. And when we focus on outcomes, there are a number of critiques that have been levied at the World Bank studies, especially, which say, look, you're prioritizing economic growth over everything else. So how do we prioritize what matters most? Do we want to prioritize the natural environment? Do we want to prioritize social variables, social well-being, or is economic growth what we want to do? So how do we step outside and come up with a non-subjective way of dealing with that? Perhaps most damningly is the question of whether we can actually credit governance to producing these observed conditions, right? So, especially perhaps with smaller countries, can we actually give government credit for economic growth or lack thereof? Can we give that government credit for social conditions or otherwise? So we have a condition of kind of very complicated causation, and it may not be fair to give credit or blame to government for the outcomes that we observe. And if through really complex interdependency of factors, can we actually reduce these things to measures and scores in the way that the World Bank does, for example, where you can say, okay, Sweden is a 9 and Burundi is a 2. What does that actually mean? Does that actually tell us something meaningful about what's going on? So I don't want to imply that we have to kind of choose one of these as kind of the master way of understanding governance quality as we move forward. But I think that thinking holistically about these perspectives can enable us to sort of see the blind spots of them and figure out what we actually want out of an understanding of good governance. We can sort of make our implicit assumptions explicit, and then if we want to move forward and redesign or design institutions or improve policies or create accountability frameworks or whatever, if we want to create systems for monitoring those things, we need to think about what actually is important to us. So all of this so far has been a very general discussion, right? It's something that could apply to any level of government, and often these discussions are focusing on national level variables, right? So the next step is to assess where we might have the most traction if we're looking at local government. So I'll now turn to that question. How might local governance systems differ from national governance systems, and how might these affect the way we think about governance quality at the local level? So, many of us in the room know that people who study urban politics, globalization, multi-level governance, and federalism argue that local actors are more or less constrained in what they can do. There are many factors that are beyond the control of local actors, local institutions. So, local governments compete for highly mobile residents, highly mobile investors, and that limits their policy autonomy. In some ways, this is the classic argument made by Paul Peterson, who made it in a very extreme and absolutist way, but there is an essential truth to it, that there's only so far that a local government, local politicians can make political choices that deviate from what their neighbors are doing, lest they undermine their capacity to retain residents and retain business. Local governments are also embedded in national and provincial policy frameworks, and in fiscal and regulatory arrangements that are beyond their control. Right? They're mixed into these webs and networks. These two limit their policy autonomy in important ways, and sometimes very positive and good ways. But what this does is it complicates the assignment of credit or blame to local governments for their actions, right? Because a lot of what they do is stuff that's mandated or partially funded by other levels of government, regulated by other levels of government, and so on. The small size of most municipal government organizations also limits the resources and capacities they have to devise and implement policy. We have to be mindful of that, that there's, only perhaps the largest municipal government organizations have a sophisticated meritocratic bureaucracy that's able to do elaborate policy development processes of the kind that we would expect higher level governments to be able to do. And finally, we need to think about how local jurisdictions, local societies, municipal societies are not independent of broader social norms. And these may also limit the scope of local initiative. So if a society faces endemic corruption, for example, it may be difficult for a single local government to run an honest shop, right? So we can talk about what this might mean in the context of Quebec, with what the Charbonneau Commission has uncovered. These are, I think, questions that we need to keep in mind. Now, at the same time, we know that there are institutional differences. Local government institutions are organized differently from provincial or national institutions in important ways. And while there's some variation across provinces, and certainly British Columbia and Quebec are the outliers in Canada, the most idiosyncratic, we know that Canadian local governments feature a number of institutional forms which differentiate them from higher levels of government. So we know that local governments across Canada have weak or weaker mayor systems. We know that there's extensive use of special purpose bodies. And so there's a far less concentrated authority structure in place than there is at the national and provincial level. And this centrifugal force changes the way that policy is made. We also know that local governments have a far more open process in policy. So there's open deliberation, there's open questioning of public servants by politicians on council floor in a way that would be unthinkable at the provincial or federal level. You just don't have members of parliament, grilling deputy ministers in the light of today. We also know that there are, in municipal acts and other legislation across the country, there are extensive consultation and reporting requirements that have to be followed in a way that I think we can safely say makes local government way more open than government at other levels. There are often mechanisms of mandated policy review. So there's cycles at which you're supposed to revisit and revise policies, and we certainly see this in the Planning Act in Ontario, for example. We also, returning to this idea of the smallness of many local governments, certainly we see as a virtue that local governments are closer to the people and more accessible to the people, because it's much easier to go down the street to City Hall than it is to somehow go to Queen's Park or to Parliament Hill to press your case. But there's also the potential for greater partiality and corruption at the local level, because it's more of a face-to-face informal politics in many cases. And certainly, you know, I have a clipping file going in my office of news accounts. You know, these things don't happen all that often, but you know, across Ontario, there's a number of cases every year where, you know, people hire their brother, you know, the Reeve hires their brother to do work, and people accept money and favors in ways that they shouldn't have, and so on. So there is a potential, due to the personalist nature of politics in small local governments, for things to not turn out okay. And again, back to this point, that due to the small scale of local bureaucracies, but they lack the capacity perhaps for robust policy learning and innovation. So, you know, it's either steady as you go, or it's copying what your neighbor did, because you just don't have the capacity to come up with new ideas. So given these institutional differences and other differences that I've discussed, how can we assess local government quality? What kind of guideposts could we follow in order to think about this? So I'm going to argue that we should probably not pay all that much attention to outcomes in terms of aggregate economic growth, socioeconomic inequality, environmental quality, and so on. There's just too many exogenous variables at work that can swamp the local scale in that way. So I'm not sure that we can, you know, despite some mayors wanting to claim this credit, I'm not sure that we can accept the notion that a mayor can stand up there and say, I created X number of jobs. I mean, this municipality is a small floating body in a larger macro economy that is probably driving these things. Similarly, the social conditions of residents are, you know, to a large degree beyond municipal control. You know, income support programs and pensions and so on. These are policies that operate at a much broader scale. So what can we pay attention to? Well, I think we should focus assessment of governance quality on processes and outputs that lie within the control of local governments. In other words, on decision-making and implementation processes, and on legislative outputs. And so we should transfer our attention to what the determinants of these things may be. So how can we think about that? Well, we know that local public administrations have a substantial amount of control over the capacity of their workforce, right? They can assist their employees and pursue hiring practices and promotion practices that facilitate the acquisition of expertise and skills, that promote competence. They can promote organizational norms privilege ethical behavior, creative problem solving, efficient work, and transparent interaction with the public. You can design your rules and your institutions to promote a meritocratic public service that has appropriate rewards built into it. So I think these kinds of organizational and institutional variables are ones that could be the object of research and analysis of good governance at the local level. Now, I don't want to imply that we don't already study these things. I think that we do. We're just not very systematic about it, and we don't join things up as much as we potentially could. So if we think about different approaches to thinking about governance quality, I think we often jump to this one, to performance benchmarking as a way to think about the quality of governance, which is really boils down to, you know, cost per number of units produced, or number of fires per 100,000 residents, or these kinds of measures. But what those things don't help us get at, these kind of dollars per unit measurements, is they don't get us very close to causality of why things are the way they are, and therefore how they can be improved. So we often do a lot of qualitative analysis of these sorts of things through various kinds of processes. You know, we know that we do program evaluations, maybe not as much as we should, but you know, these things are done. Audit often occurs, right? We do have municipal auditors general in many municipalities, and in some provinces, the province manages that function. We have investigations on complaint to municipal or provincial ombudsman and other types of bodies. And we have a provision for appeal in certain circumstances. So the Ontario Municipal Board in the planning context plays that kind of role. So we can look at those as kind of single case qualitative studies of local government quality if we want. The problem is, how do we stitch those together into coming up with a better understanding of where the weak spots are in a more systematic way. You know, often we know that as policy processes are pursued, that people working in government will do multi-case comparisons, right? The kind of multi-jurisdictional policy scans that they do. Well, you know, sitting here in London, we can look at what Waterloo is doing and what Hamilton is doing, that kind of thing. That sort of thing happens all the time. But I wonder if maybe we can learn more about those things, if we can leverage them to make more useful comparisons and systematic comparisons across divisions and municipalities. So in the paper, I talk more about different the pros and cons of different approaches that are taken as a way to start to make a case about what could be done. But clearly, the more you are on the left-hand side of this, the more you can get at actual causal stories about where processes break down and where processes go right. The problem is that especially the more cases you have and the more in-depth you get, the more expensive it is to do, and that's why we don't do it, except in particular situations that are often triggered by crisis or a problem being recognized as having occurred, such as an audit or a complaint or investigation or something like that. We gravitate towards performance benchmarking and performance measurement because it's cheap and easily communicated. But you know, the problems that we have with this is that we aren't necessarily sure if these scores that we're calculating actually tell us something meaningful about actual processes and problems, and they provide little insight into what causes what. I want to talk a little bit about performance benchmarking. You know, there has been a number of independent studies that have taken the performance benchmarking data in the three provinces that actually do it, Ontario and Quebec and Nova Scotia, and analyze them. And what they find is that in the dozen or so years, 15 years in Ontario plus, that we have had these reporting requirements where municipalities are supposed to you know, calculate these standardized scores and remit them to the province, that not a lot has happened. There's this fellow, Etienne Charbonneau, who did quite a substantial piece of work on this. And he found that there's very little change in the relative position of municipalities. If you go from 1999 through to the present in Ontario and look at the municipal performance benchmarks, that high-scoring municipalities are still high-scoring municipalities, and low-scoring municipalities are still low-scoring municipalities. So there's very little evidence that this has driven any kind of continuous improvement. There's also been studies that have interviewed municipal public servants to ask how they use performance benchmarks. And in general, interview and survey work has shown that they're primarily used to defend or mobilize political support for bureaucratic projects, rather than drive continuous improvement. None of the provincial governments that have implemented these really quite onerous requirements to provide hundreds of data points year over year, none of them have tied rewards or penalties to your scores, right? What we saw, especially in the Labour government of the last decade in the UK, is that they rewarded places that brought their scores up, and they punished places that whose scores were going down, and that was a bit of a sobering thing for those municipalities. They reacted to those incentives. So, would that be good or bad? I don't know. But it's probably worth talking about given the amount of effort that's put into this. I spoke not long ago to the senior public servant who designed the MPMP program, or was responsible for its design back in the late 90s. And he said, yeah, we talked about this, but it was politically impossible. We needed to, the conservative government of the day believed that this was something that needed to be done. We needed to quantify performance measures, but there was absolutely zero thought to what you do with them afterwards, and they were politically unwilling to tie anything to these. And if anyone has ever gone to look at these data on the Ministry of Municipal Affairs website in Ontario, and it's even worse in Nova Scotia and Quebec, you will find that they are almost impossible to manipulate. You could spend days cleaning up this data in order to get to the point of being able to make a simple graph from them. So there's really no effort into making this open so that watchdog groups and the public can make use of it, even if nobody else is. So I think we need to think carefully about performance benchmarking, because this is an apparatus we already have. Yeah, I'm wrapping up. But we did start almost 10 minutes late, Mark. So what do I think we need to know about? Well, I think that we could train our research on questions of how variation in institutional structures may, what impact that may have on process and output quality. We know that we have different municipal structures in terms of ward or at-large systems. We have very little variation in, say, the power of the mayor, right? But we may be evolving in different directions that way. But that's something I think we should look at. Other kinds of institutions that we should look at is, does it matter if you have an integrity commissioner or not? Does it matter if you have an internal auditor general or not? Does it matter if you have these kinds of accountability mechanisms built into your municipality, or if you're relying on the province to do it for you? I think we could do more to investigate the degree to which institutions, as opposed to cultural approaches, are determinants of ethical and competent behavior. One of the reactions to the MFP inquiry in the city of Toronto over a decade ago was to create highly prescriptive institutional changes that were supposed to drive people's behavior in a positive direction. But if your staff is demoralized, are the institutions enough, or do you need to really focus on cultural questions? I don't think we know nearly enough about public engagement practices. We certainly talk a lot about it, but then we don't actually know very much about how it works, or even how to think about how well it works. I think we need to think about accountability gaps in alternative service delivery arrangements and multi-level governance arrangements. Increasingly, this is sort of how public services are being delivered. And these are very complicated in terms of the way their accountability works. And I'm not sure we know as much as we should. And finally, back to this earlier point, I think we need to have a discussion about if we're going to have performance measures, do we want to tie them to carrots and sticks if we aren't actually using them for any real purpose? If nobody's using them for any real purpose, why waste probably the millions of dollars that are being spent across the province in running these systems if they don't seem to be driving any kind of change in the efficiency or operations of government? So that is my overview. Thank you very much. And please go look at the paper and tell me what you think about it. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Zack. Sorry if I was rushing you there at the end, but I did want to just
No, I know, it's later than I thought.
Because you put a lot on the table, so a little bit of time for people to ask some questions. So I have some, but I'll hold it for now. Please go ahead.
Andy.
I have a few questions. I'll just start with one. First, I should say there's a lot of students in my class who are here, and they know that this paper is assigned as the last reading in the class for 2 weeks from now. I must admit that even though I put it on the class list, I haven't read it myself yet. It's kind of a last minute.
It's much clearer than my presentation.
So this question might reflect the fact that I haven't read the whole thing. But I was struck the question is sparked by this stuff about capacity and scale and capacity, that kind of thing. And in everything you talked about in this presentation, there's nothing about community, matching local governments to recognizable territorial communities. And I thought, well, gee, if you wanted to have more policy capacity, you would just create one huge local government for Southwestern Ontario or Southern Ontario or something. You'd have a whole lot of policy capacity, but you wouldn't be matching the local to the community. So if you're talking about good governance at the local level, I guess my question is, where does the concept of territorial, matching that to territorial communities come in?
That is the anti-sanction question. Yeah. I mean, there is a virtue to that, right? Now, we may find that for any given service, diseconomies set in at a relatively low threshold. We may be able to find some objective way to define what a community is. If we took all the borders off and then sort of looked down at the province and said, okay, let's start drawing some lines about what a community may be. I could imagine that we could do that. You know, some of these places will be quite small and some of them may be larger, and in most cases they might be smaller than what we already have, right? But then we need to think about the question of what those administrative entities are supposed to do, and are they of a size that can do it well, right? So, you know, we're not back in the Smith Commission trying to design in 1966-67, design a local government system for Ontario from scratch, right? And we'll never be in that. We'll never pretend that that's possible again. You know, is that a criterion on the process side? Sure. You know, it can be part of this whole discussion about all the other ways that we can think about quality of governance. And we could say the process may work better if you have a homogeneous community, because you have high social capital, because everybody's the same and they all know each other. And
well, I won't pursue the whole debate, but I just want to say, I mean, if you're concerned about outputs and outcomes, you would clearly want to match the outputs and outcomes to what people in particular communities want, rather than some arbitrary, large
Right.
territory that might have a whole lot of policy capacity. That's my only point.
Sure. And if you follow that kind of public choice argument, you end up basically invalidating the whole notion of benchmarking.
That's right. I did not give a public choice
Okay.
argument there. That had nothing to do with public choice.
Okay.
It had to do with territorial communities.
So if communities articulate their own preferences, right, and some people would rather spend their money in some way, and other communities would rather spend their money in other ways, the whole point of that is to have variation in service delivery across space, right? So that invalidates the whole idea of this kind of post hoc benchmarking. Because why would you want to compare if the whole point of it is not to have them converge on a high level of high scores, right? Because some people may desire low scores in some dimensions and high scores in other dimensions. So, yeah, Bob.
I have an issue, I'm afraid, with your pessimism about measuring outcomes at the local level. I mean, it's clear that you can't attribute the level of municipal GDP to the municipal government. That would be highly improbable. The same thing with job creation and many other conditions that exist in municipalities. But I don't think we should write off the whole prospect. There are very important things that are largely under the control of municipal governments that can be measured. The degree of forest cover in the city, the percentage of materials that are recycled, the amount of time that you spend in stupid traffic jams because of construction. I mean, these are very important outcomes, and they're directly consequential on the activities of the municipal government. And as for attributing causality, well, that's a piece of cake. All you need is a bunch of cases, either over time or cross-sectionally, and you can attribute causality as well as you can attribute it anywhere.
So I would accept that. The angle, the way that I entered that outcomes-oriented space is from this, the way I find it in the literature, which is this national level macro issue. And when I've, so, you know, I would accept that there are things that can be measured, right, that may be meaningful outcomes. So some nuance on that could be useful for sure. Yeah, Martin?
Oh, I'm just going to jump in on this one quickly because I was thinking about outcomes as well. In work that I did years ago on Prague, I decided to set aside the outcomes thing as well. But it wasn't so much because I thought that local government didn't have any control over any effective outcomes. It was because of the argument that outcomes are normatively latent, right? And so you can't make some general statement about what are good outcomes across different political units because people make different choices, right? So, but if you have in a particular political unit, you've made a choice and you've set a goal to, you know, have 40% forest cover, you know, whether or not you're meeting that outcome goal is obviously a valid measure, right? So it depends on whether you're conceptualizing outcomes as some sort of, you know, generalized category of these are the things that should be good in the same way across all local governments versus outcomes as the ultimate outputs of a policy process. So, so that's maybe a distinction to think about.
I mean, there's different ways to measure policy effectiveness, right? One is to measure it against the intentions of the policy. You know, another is to measure it against some kind of objective standard,
Exactly.
right?
And that's the one that becomes more problematic, right?
Yeah.
Objective standards of outcomes, like, you know.
Well, the World Bank's, you know, criterion is one of their heavily loaded criteria is degree of marketization and market friendliness. Right? So they, you know, that doesn't leave much room for a place to decide to have a more statist solution to something.
Yeah.
So the normativity creeps its way in.
Okay, I'm going to throw one last question at you.
All right,
all right. It's going up. I guess it's more common than a question. It's also about the outcomes piece. So I agree with you basically that, you know, you can't set normative standards of outcomes that are easily universally applied. So say we focus on process and outputs, as you suggested that we did. There's still a bit of a problem there, and this does come to the limited political control part, and that's that politically, people who run for local office are forever promising things that they can't actually do, right? So, the mayor elect promises he'll make, create 10,000 jobs or whatever. So there is a political tendency to overpromise. And then, at election time, it looks like the municipality is underperformed to the public. And that might be the case, despite the fact that the processes and the policy outputs are good. It's just that the promises were not realistic, right? So how do we square, an academic or administrative or public policy perspective on good governance with that political logic? And does it matter for what you're talking about?
Yeah, well, one thing that you find in the study of good governance or governance quality is that it's strangely depoliticized, right?
Yeah.
They've kind of leaked all the actual politics out of it in a way that I don't think is all that helpful. And to some degree, I had to kind of accept that framework as I proceeded through this project. The way that the process-oriented people try to get around this is they say, well, if the process is just good enough, then the politics will all get worked out through that process, right? It becomes murkier and more complicated when we're looking at outputs and outcomes.
Okay. Well, thanks again to Zach, and thanks to everybody for being here.
Thank you.